So I've become one of those people who takes this stuff, methylfolate. It's been a game changer for me, and if you stay around, I'll tell the story. So gotta say the thing I always say, I'm not a healthcare provider. I don't give medical advice. If you need medical advice, please talk to a licensed provider you trust. Don't just take anyone's word for it off the internet. So the story is I gave up caffeine completely at the beginning of May, and I had stepped down the amount I was consuming for about 6 months before that. But I had been a caffeine consumer since I was 13 years old, and so several decades all through my adult life. And even after stepping down, I still had about 3 days of pretty rough withdrawals. The night sweats, inability sleeping, hopelessness, terrible thoughts. That all started to subside after about 2.5 days. But then after that, I continued to have fatigue and lack of desire to do things, to go out and complete projects. And I expected that would go away. I thought it would just kind of get better on its own. But after about 6 weeks, it was still going on and on and on. I mean, I love to work out, but I'd get out, and after about 30 minutes of exercise, I would just feel like, I don't want to do this anymore. And completing any project felt like that. Even worse, I would start talking and I'd forget the words I wanted to say. In fact, I would stop mid-sentence, forget what I was even talking about, and not even feel like restarting the sentence. And I was starting to be like, what is the matter with me? Is this early onset dementia? Am I going into major depression? What's the problem here? Well, the TikTok algorithm kept showing me ads for methylfolate, and I'm not the kind that's going to buy anything off of an ad. But then I actually met a couple people in real life who were taking it because they had a gene variant that didn't allow them to produce folate naturally within their own liver, at least not at the level they needed to. So that's when I actually started looking into some of the science, which I'll explain now. So folate is a methyl donor, and you've got a couple different forms in your body that actually do the methyl donation. I'll talk about those in a couple minutes. But a methyl group is basically just a methane, carbon with 4 hydrogens, and you can break off one of those hydrogens if you have it in water, and then you get this group that you can attach onto other large molecules. And when you attach it on there, it can make them do more, it can make them do less. You can also add a bunch of them on to make a molecule less stable. You can also break apart larger molecules into these methyl groups, reattach hydrogens from water to them, and then emit this methane as a waste. That's why you have a lot of methane gas in like cow farts or in coming off of the landfill. So here's a pretty important use for methane within cells. This is DNA, and when DNA is all wound up into chromosomes, you know, the little X-shaped chromosomes, it's kind of held together on these proteins, held onto there with these methyl groups. And then to make use of it, you got to break those methyl groups off, unspool it, and then add other methyl groups on. And that's basically what epigenetics is. Now, there are other groups that can be used, for example, acetyl groups, but the primary groups that get used are these methyl groups. And then when that DNA is no longer needed, when that particular gene doesn't have to be in use anymore, you can take off those methyl groups, put it away, put on the new ones to keep it in its place. So all these words here are different molecules, but this is the process that basically produces the molecules that donate those methyl groups over to DNA and proteins. In this case, that ultimate molecule is SAMe. And once it donates that methyl group, it kind of has to be broken into these other pieces, and then B12 donates a methyl group to make methionine. Anyway, that's a whole chain. But B12 is getting regenerated by this, by folate. specifically the methylated version of folate. And then folate has to go through its whole cycle to be regenerated. So the chain of that process is folate donates to B12, which donates to methionine so it can become SAMe, and SAMe donates to DNA. So here's another one. This is BH4, and BH4 also donates methyl groups. And when it gets recycled, here, this DHFR is also folate. So in order for BH4 to be used, it has to get methyl groups from folate. Well, what is BH4 used for? Well, what BH4 does is it donates methyl groups to tryptophan and tyrosine. The tyrosine chain becomes dopamine and norepinephrine, and the tryptophan chain becomes serotonin. You might recognize those as neurotransmitters. In fact, if you've heard of the term SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, it's basically trying to push up the level of serotonin in your brain. So here's that methylfolate donating methyl groups to produce BH4, and then that BH4 donates those methyl groups to produce neurotransmitters. So what folate is doing is it's kind of being the nymphomaniac of the process. It's giving up its methyl groups easily so other molecules can make use of them. As I mentioned, there's different forms of folate that are used in the body. You've got these two, for example. This is the whole chain. So if you're consuming folic acid, which is a synthetic form of folate, it isn't really produced in nature. It has to go through this whole chain to be converted over to methylfolate so it can eventually be converted into these two other useful forms. And you can see this NAD and NADH molecules here. Those are actually, you can think of them as an energy currency. In the mitochondria, you produce ATP and NADPH. ATP can be thought of as like the dollar bills of energy in your cell, and NADH can be thought of as the nickels. So this isn't really a super high energy process. So if we were all growing gardens and catching fish and eating food like right from the food chain, it's loaded with folate, with the methylated form of folate. But we don't do that. Our food has to go through this long chain. And in that process, folate breaks down. It's actually pretty unstable as far as vitamins go. And right here, as you can see, they are largely destroyed by cooking up to 90%. Moreover, the bioavailability of these is only about 60-65% in most cases, which probably wouldn't matter too much if we had these amazing fresh diets, but unfortunately we don't. Now, this has been known for a long time, so all the way back in the 50s, companies started producing folic acid and putting it into food. Now, like I mentioned, folic acid is synthetic. It doesn't have those active methyl groups on it. Now, it is very stable, but there are problems with it. For example, a 2014 published study clearly showed that 86% of folic acid in the hepatic portal vein, basically the liver vein, is unmetabolized, while almost all the natural folate was converted correctly into those useful molecules. A second problem, unmethylated folic acid may compete with natural folate for the folate transporter and the folate receptor, thus depleting active folate for participation in metabolic cycles. Now, I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm not going to talk about the other studies I saw that talk about things like dementia and cognition and depression. And you can look into those and talk with your doctor or psychiatrist. But here's what happened with me. I started just taking this stuff every other day, and within a week, I felt like I had my mojo back, I felt like I had my cognition back, and my ability to speak, I felt like it had come back. I feel like my energy levels are better. When I wake up in the morning, I don't feel like laying in bed for an hour. I feel like getting up and going after it within 10 or 15 minutes. I got a lot planned today, hopefully going to do some racquetball, do a little hiking, some DIY, maybe a little writing. So have a good day, and I'll see you next time.